Couple of bills for you this week, a couple of your priorities, in fact. Got a lot of time on the floor in regards to some changes in the way some of the infrastructure regulations are in this state.
That's right. 2 utility bills, one that affects electricity, one that affects water, Senate Bill 190 and Senate Bill 184. One of the difficulties that we have passing any utility legislation is it is a very complicated arena. There's a lot to try to wrap your head around as a legislator, and so there's always lots of discussion. There frequently is a focus that would presume that all regulatory reform means is that we're going to increase rates to consumers. And so there's always the effort to make sure that if consumers are going to be paying for something, that they're getting value for what they're paying for. And so Senate Bill 190 is about that. Senate Bill 190 is actually acknowledging that we have over 100-year-old infrastructure, what we call the grid in Missouri, and that there are penalties, both in terms of inconvenience and in terms of cost, to having an infrastructure that is that old. Could certainly be significantly improved by upgrading and modernizing that infrastructure. Some states, 46 states, have in some fashion modernized their regulatory processes, which have allowed them to begin modernizing their grids, and they've all done very well along those. Some have actually seen cost decreases in terms of their monthly bills once they got the modernized grid in place and eliminated some of the waste, some of the lost power that happens in older grids, and also much of the maintenance cost that happens with the elements of the older grid. We're not enjoying any of those savings right now. The focus tends to be on how additional money was going to be spent and whether that is unfair to the consumer. In my opinion, the way Senate Bill 190 is written, it is to the benefit of consumers to upgrade and modernize that grid infrastructure to get to the place where, for example, in what might be an outage today might be no more than a flicker once you have that modern grid with redundancies and other aspects of improvement. On the other hand, if there is an interruption, that power might be brought on in a matter of minutes rather than hours, or in a matter of seconds rather than minutes, even in some cases, once all the automatic controls and other things are put in place that are not there now. So we're looking at trying to do that, trying to gain some of the benefits that would come from modernizing that grid, as well as the security aspects. We all know that cybersecurity is a very big deal in this world, and a lot of things can be done in modernizing a grid to help secure the grid against threats of cybersecurity that may be there now. So 190 is an attempt to address all of those. We had it on the floor for a number of hours. We reached a point where we really weren't getting any meaningful compromises offered or changes suggested. It was simply a matter of holding the floor. So we laid the bill over. I'm working with the senators who are in support and the senators who are in opposition to try to come up with some kind of a solution and a resolution so that we can begin that modernization of the grid. 184 is a little bit similar. I mean, it has to do with water and sewer. We're not talking electricity, but it is also an element of upgrading the infrastructure. Missouri American Water, for example, has pipes in the ground that are old enough that some of them are actually still wooden pipes. A lot of people didn't even know there ever were wooden pipes, but I have actual photographs of some of those wooden pipes that have been dug up in the process of replacing some of the mains and other aspects of water and sewer service. All of us understand the risk that weather has to both our home bills and to a water company. Those risks are even greater, because what can happen is if a water company is planning on a certain level of sales in order to maintain its operational stability, and there's a very wet year, then most of us buy a lot less water. We don't water our lawns, we don't water our gardens, and so the revenues to the water company go down dramatically and can completely disrupt a business plan and certainly have a significant impact on the cash flow. Some folks, and I know my mother was one of those, who did on some of their utilities what's called budget billing. That's where the company would say, okay, you're going to pay so much a month, and at the end of the year, we'll decide if you've overpaid or underpaid. Well, this isn't budget billing exactly, but it has kind of the same effect in Senate Bill 184. It says that instead of authorizing just a rate per gallon, that the PSC would actually authorize a certain amount of revenue that the company could accumulate over a period of a year. And if they recovered more revenue than that, if there was a very dry year and the company accrued more revenue because people were watering their yards and watering their gardens returns, then those folks would actually get a rebate because the cost per gallon had gone down for the company. They would not be paying as much for the water, so they wouldn't be able to charge as much for the water. On the other hand, if it was a very wet year, for example, and all of us purchased less water, we would still have much lower monthly bills. Our bills would be significantly lower according to the number of gallons that we purchased. But the water company would be allowed over the next 12 months to put a small surcharge, maybe 50 cents, maybe $1, maybe even $1.50 on our bill to make up the revenue that was not recovered because they just were not able to sell enough water. So it has the same type of effect as a budget billing. It just doesn't have as dramatic effect because your water bill still will be largely dependent on whether you use a lot of water or a small amount of water.
Over in the House, a couple of bills, one of which we've seen at least one Senate version of on the floor and at least two versions in different committees. Prescription Drug Monitoring Program and prevailing wage have both been passed through the Missouri House.
That's right. I am strongly in favor of prevailing wage. I'm strongly against the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. I think we probably have talked about that before and maybe some of my reasons for opposition, but my biggest reason for opposing what we know as PDMP is that it has been ineffective in 49 other states. We often praise the system that we have in the United States, that we have 50 laboratories of democracy, and that means we have 50 different places where policies can be tested and can be tried out. Missouri is often criticized that we're the only state in the country that does not have a PDMP, but it is interesting that when we look at the other 49 laboratories of democracy, that we are not seeing positive results from those 49. That causes me to really pause and say, wait a minute, do we really want to follow the crowd on this one? I've looked at the CDC data in terms of drug-related deaths, and most of the data say that when you move to a PDMP system, there is no statistically significant change in the number of drug-related deaths. The other thing that I observed when I looked at the list of 49 states was that just by count, there were actually more states that had seen an increase in drug-related deaths than there were states that had seen a decrease, even though none of them were considered statistically significant. One of the reasons for that, if you talk to the doctors that are in the House, Missouri House, or the doctors in the Missouri Senate, one of the reasons that he will suggest is that when a person can't get their prescription drugs, what they will do is shift to heroin. And heroin is a more deadly drug. So it's possible that we are moving some people off of prescription drug abuses, but we're not moving them off drugs. We're not addressing the root cause. We're simply trying to treat a symptom. And the problem with that is you're treating it for everyone. So you're gathering data from every patient, not just the ones who might be offenders, not just the ones who might try to abuse those prescriptions, but from everyone. And everyone's data would then be accessible to a hacker in one way or another. That data could be used against them if they were trying to run for office or if they were trying to get a job somewhere or just as a personal vendetta. And so there are a lot of ways that it could be abused. The best way to secure individual data is not to collect it anywhere. That's why I've consistently opposed PDMP. I was talking to some doctors a few weeks ago, and one of them mentioned that in his state that had PDMP before he moved to Missouri, that only 23% of the doctors used it. If you talk to those who have studied the drug usage, they will tell you that it may be only around 3% of the illicit drugs that actually are from prescription shopping, that the rest of them are from somebody robbing their neighbor's medicine chest or medicine cabinet or stealing it from their parents. If you actually run numbers on that, what you're saying is you're affecting about 7% of the problem, but it's affecting all of the people. To me, that's not a very good return on taking some liberty away. In terms of prevailing wage, that has such great potential for Missouri, particularly in our public service projects, our public works issues, schools, hospitals, those areas that now have to pay wages, and particularly in our rural areas. I had a call from one school who wanted to know what the impact would be on their contract. They're facing potentially some investments in upgrading their air conditioning and heating system. It's going to be a significant expenditure, and they're probably going to have to go out for a bond and get a vote. And they wanted to know what's likely to be the impact on the cost of that project if they do it under prevailing wage versus under current conditions. And the answer to that is it's going to be about a 30% reduction in what it costs those taxpayers, what it costs those folks that support that school district. And so I was happy to tell them that, but I was also happy that we have some school superintendents and school boards that are saying, we need to get as much value out of every taxpayer dollar that we can. And if we can do that, even by waiting until we ask for competitive bids as opposed to being locked into some rate that came out making come out of St. Louis or Kansas City, then we can save our rural areas some money, because that's usually where the biggest disparity comes. In our rural areas, the wages that are typically being charged by companies that do these construction projects are significantly below what you might have to pay if you were in an urban area like St. Louis, Kansas City, or even Springfield. And by forcing those wages down to my rural counties, we are penalizing those taxpayers significantly. So I'm happy that prevailing wage is on its way to the Senate. I know it won't be an easy fight. We've taken up a lot of things this year that are not easy fights, including Senate Bill 190 and Senate Bill 184, and I hope that we're willing to fight to the finish.